Hey there, today we are going to take a look at a cubic equation and all of the steps that are necessary in order to find all of the solutions to solve a cubic equation. So the equation that we are going to look at will be f of x equals x to the third plus 3x squared minus 13x minus 15. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to just plug in numbers in order to check whether a number makes our whole equation equal to 0. Our definition of a solution is that when plugged in, it makes our whole function equal to 0. So if, for instance, I were to plug in the number 7, and that were to make the whole equation equal to 0, then 7 would be considered a solution. Now, obviously, if we are plugging in numbers, there are an infinite number of numbers. How do we know which numbers to plug in? Well, we are looking at our factors of our constant term right here. So this 15, I'm going to write this 15 off on the side. And I want all of the numbers that divide 15 evenly, both positive and negative. So that's going to be 1, negative 1, 2, doesn't work, 3 and negative 3, 5, negative 5, and then 15, negative 15. These are the only possibilities for whole numbers. It is possible that you could have a fraction if there is a number in front of the x right here, in which case you would take all of these factors here divided by all of the factors in front of a. But in general, I would suggest only checking the whole number solutions and not using the fraction solutions, because fraction solutions make these problems significantly more difficult. So I would strongly encourage you to only use the whole number solutions for this process here. So I want to just start with my easiest numbers. I'm going to start with a positive 1 right here, and I'm going to plug positive 1 in for all of my x's right here. So I'm going to rewrite my function, but I'm going to leave the x's blank for the moment. And then in a moment here, I can write my positive 1 in those parentheses. And I tend to always start with positive 1 because positive 1 is probably the easiest number to work with, mathematically speaking. So 1 to the third power is still going to be 1 because it's 1 times 1 times 1. Here we have 3 times by 1 squared. So the 3 will stay the same for the moment, but 1 squared will be 1. So I've got 3 times by 1 right there. And then I've got 13 times by 1, which I'll leave the same for the moment. And then I still have my minus 15 here. Now, when we actually do our multiplication here, the 1 stays the same. The 3 also stays the same. The minus 13 also stays the same. And the minus 15, nothing happens there. The only reason those numbers all stayed the same was because we're multiplying by 1. Like I said, it's the easiest number to start with. So we see here that we have 1 plus 3, which gives us 4. 4 minus 13 gives us negative 9. And negative 9 minus 15 gives us negative 24. So if this all combines to get negative 24, then we know that 1 is not a solution here, because if we get any number other than 0, then we do not have a solution. So 1 doesn't work. I can cross this 1 out, and I can go on to try the next number. Now, you may prefer to try all of the positive numbers first. You may try negative 1 next. It just depends on what you think is easiest. I'm going to work negative 1 next, and I'm going to see if this gives me a solution. So I'm going to leave that part right there. And then I'm going to rewrite my original equation. But this time I'm going to plug in -1 rather than +1. And as I like to say, the most common types of mistakes on these problems generally come from misplaced negative signs. So be careful about your negatives on these problems. They can be a little tricky. So -1 to the third power, a negative times a negative times a negative will still be negative. So I've got -1 right here. -1 squared, negative times a negative is now positive. So 3 times by +1 will be +3. And then here, -13 times by -1 will now become +13 instead of -13. Lastly, the -15 will stay the same. So now if we combine these together, we have -1 plus 3, which is 2, and then 2 plus 13 is 15, and 15 minus 15 gives us 0 here. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So that means our first solution here is x equals -1. So we can say x equals -1 is a solution. So we have found the first of our 3 solutions, and we're going to take this solution and we are going to use this to perform synthetic division. So if you've not seen synthetic division, I will go ahead and put a link for that in the comments down below. But here is us going through the process with synthetic division here. So we're going to take this solution right here, and I'm going to put this off on the side in a little green box here. So -1 is going to go in this green box right here. Whatever solution you find is going to go in this little box. The next thing we want to do is we want to write out our coefficients. So our coefficients from our original equation in front of x to the third, x squared, x, and then our constant term right here. So my coefficients for this problem will be 1, 3, -13, and -15. We don't include the x's, we don't include the exponents, we only want the coefficients. So now, in order to perform synthetic division, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by dropping down the number that I have right here. So whatever number this is, in this case it's 1, I'm just going to bring that down below the line. And then I'm going to multiply whatever number I have below the line times by the green number that I have here in the box. So in this case, I'll have 1 times by -1, which will be -1. And I'm going to place that just below the 3 on the next line. So I'm going to have -1 right here. I'm going to take the 2 numbers that are above the line and I'm going to add them together. So 3 plus -1, or 3 minus 1, becomes +2. And then once again, I want to multiply the number that is below the line times by the number that I have in the box. So 2 times by -1 is going to give me -2, and I'm going to bring that up here. Then once again, I want to add the 2 numbers that I have above the line. Once again, be careful about your negative signs because we see we've got a lot of negatives here. So -13 plus -2 is the same thing as -13 minus 2, and that will be -15. Once again, we need to multiply the number that's below the line times by our solution in the box here. So -15 times by -1 will give us +15 right here. And then we combine our last 2 numbers together. -15 plus +15 should give us 0. And this is exactly what we want. If you get 0 here, that means you've done your work correctly. If you don't get 0 here, that either means there's been an error in your synthetic division, or this number here is not a solution. because this 0 here essentially counts as our remainder for the division. And if we don't get a 0 here, that means we need to go back and check our work. But since we've got 0 here, we know that we've been doing our work correctly and we're ready to proceed to the next step. So I'm going to rewrite these first 3 numbers as a quadratic equation now. So we still have f of x. And since we essentially divided by our solution, we are now 1 power lower than before. So we started as x to the 3rd, and now we are going to be x squared. And we're going to start with 1x squared, because that's our first coefficient, plus 2x, because 2 is our next coefficient, and then minus 15. 15 is now our constant term. There's no x with a 15. But we have rewritten our cubic equation now as a quadratic equation after we have performed that synthetic division. So we got our first solution here. And we divided that out of our original equation, and we are left with this quadratic equation here. Now, you can solve this any number of ways. You can solve by factoring. You can solve using the quadratic formula. You could even solve by completing the square. And I will include videos linked down below in the comment section for those 3 methods. But I'm going to go ahead and solve this using factoring, because I see that there are 2 numbers that multiply to negative 15 that will add to positive 2. And those 2 numbers are going to be positive 5 and negative 3, which means that I'm going to be able to split this into the 2 parentheses, x plus 5 and x minus 3. Once I have factored this into 2 parentheses, and remember, not every problem can be factored, so some problems you may need to use the quadratic formula. Once I have factored this into 2 parentheses, I set each one equal to 0 and solve it out. So I've got x plus 5 equals 0, and I also have x minus 3 equals 0. Then I just solve each of these 2 equations out. First one, I'm going to subtract 5 on both sides. And that will give me x equals negative 5. The second one, I will add 3 on both sides. And that will give me x equals negative 3. So all 3 of these are solutions. All 3 of these are considered to be solutions for this equation here. So the way that I would write my final answer is I would say x equal, let's not make that green, let's make that black so it's easier to read. X equals negative 5, x equals negative 3, and x equals negative 1. Oh, that should be a positive 3, not a negative 3. And x equals negative 1 are all solutions there we go, to the cubic equation. Now you should notice here that we do have 3 solutions, and in general, there will be 3 solutions for all of your cubic equations. Now, some of those solutions might be the same number. Potentially, those solutions could be imaginary numbers as well, but there should, in general, be 3 solutions for every cubic equation.